Hello and welcome back to Jekyll and Hyde, Annotate with an Examiner. We are now on chapter 8, The Last Night. This is a really important chapter. There's lots and lots of key quotations in here and lots of events that happen that lead to the revelations of Jekyll. So as always, you may want to pause the video here so you can go and grab your copy of Jekyll and Hyde, a pen, a highlighter and even a notepad as well, so that you can record some key quotations and use them for when it comes to revision. It is quite a long chapter, so I am going to split it up into two sections. So this is going to be part 1 and next week we will be uploading part 2. So press pause, go and grab what you need to and then come back and press play when you're ready. So let's get started. Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner when he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole. "Bless me, Poole, what brings you here?" he cried, and then taking a second look at him. "What ails you?" he added. "Is the doctor ill?" "Mr. Utterson," said the man, "there is something wrong." "Take a seat, and here is a glass of wine for you," said the lawyer. "Now take your time and tell me plainly what you want." "You know the doctor's ways, sir," replied Poole, "and how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it, Mr. Utterson, sir. I'm afraid." So Poole is Jekyll's faithful servant. He's of a different social class to the other men in the novel, so he lacks the reserve of the others. He's less articulate and sophisticated, and he's also very quick to show emotion in comparison to the other characters. "Now, my good man," said the lawyer, "be explicit. What are you afraid of?" "I've been afraid for about a week," returned Poole, doggedly, disregarding the question, "and I can bear it no more." So notice here how he disregards the question. The silence and repression of Jekyll's society has extended to all members of his circle, and now even Poole is unable to speak about his fears. The pressure of this repression takes its toll on the characters. So we've seen it with Utterson, we've seen it with Enfield, we've seen it even to some extent with, well, actually a large extent, especially towards the end of his life with Lanyon, and now we see it with Poole as well. Poole seems to have internalized the secrets of his master and looks visibly worn out and even ill, just like Lanyon did. The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worse, and except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. So this isn't the first time we've met a character that has been gravely altered by some terrible shock. So think about Lanyon before his death. Poole won't even look at Utterson in the face, and this is a question for you to answer in the comments below. Why is this, do you think? Why can Poole not look Utterson in the face? Does this hint at something he is afraid of, or does it hint at something that he's ashamed of? What do you think? Let me know. Remember that to be critical is a really highly awarded skill by the exam boards, so that's what I'm trying to encourage you guys to do, to be as critical as possible. So that you can maximize your marks in the exam. Even now he sat with a glass of wine untasted on his knee, and his eyes directed to a corner of the floor. "I can bear it no more," he repeated. "Come," said the lawyer, "I see you have some good reason, Poole. I see there is something seriously amiss. Try to tell me what it is." "I think there's been foul play," said Poole hoarsely. So Poole is a prime example here of a character repressing his suspicions for fear of the consequences. The phrase foul play is a euphemism, so it's a word, euphemistic language, or euphemisms are words that are purposefully subtle to sort of make it seem less important or less harsh, covering up all kinds of possibilities with its mild sporting connotations. "Foul play!" cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. "What foul play? What does the man mean?" "I daren't say, sir," was the answer, "but will you come along with me and see for yourself?" So clearly Poole is really afraid and just doesn't really know how to articulate himself. Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and greatcoat, but he observed with wonder the greatness of the relief that appeared upon the butler's face, and perhaps with no less, that the wine was still untasted when he set it down to follow. It was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and a flying rack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. So we've got here the use of the rule of three to describe the weather, and pathetic fallacy again used to mirror and foreshadow the chaos that is about to ensue in this chapter. We've also got the clever use of personification here, and throughout actually this passage there's the clever use of personification, but here we've got the personification of the moon to highlight the absurdity and the strangeness of the night. It's a famous pattern in Gothic horror that particular elements of the landscape and atmosphere serve to forebode the changing fate of the characters. So here the blustery night and the familiar haunted street of Jekyll's laboratory, as well, that we've seen later on and we'll see again in a moment, is enough to prompt fear and suspense. The wind made talking difficult and flecked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers. Besides, for Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures, for struggle as he might, there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. So again, throughout this we had the use of pathetic fallacy, which is mirroring Utterson's feelings of impending doom. The square, when they got there, was all full of wind and dust, and the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. Poole, who had kept all the way a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. But for all the hurry of his coming, these were not the dews of exertion that he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish. So here, Poole doesn't explain the cause of this anguish, despite the hyperbolic strangling that he's really struggling with and suffering. It seems that he's very much suffering in silence, because perhaps he can't articulate what he's about to say, what he's about to show Utterson, or maybe there's something more to it. For his face was white, and his voice, when he spoke, harsh and broken. "Well, sir," he said, "here we are, and God grant there be nothing wrong." "Amen, Poole," said the lawyer. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain, and a voice asked from within, "Is that you, Poole?" "It's all right," said Poole. "Open the door." The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, and about the hearth the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook, crying out, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson," ran forward, as if to take him in her arms. What? Are you all here?" said the lawyer peevishly. "Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased." So unseemly means unsuitable. So this is a bit of a strange thing to say, considering what's happening, and obviously the clear anguish and anxiety that all of these servants are feeling. So this is a remarkable sight in such a conventional society where Utterson has always found servants in the same positions. Now all of a sudden the servants have become real people to him. But his denial makes him overlook their fear, so his denial of them being human, of deserving empathy, overlook their fear and concern, and he seems to concern himself more with their breach of duty in leaving their stations than in sort of tending to them and helping them and making them feel better. So again, you could argue that this links to the theme of hypocrisy. "They're all afraid," said Poole. Blank silence followed, and no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly. "Hold your tongue," Poole said to her, with a ferocity of accents that testified to his own jangled nerves, and indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentation, they had all started and turned towards the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation. So lamentation is like really deep, crying, weeping. "And now," continued the butler, addressing the knife boy, "reach me a candle, and we'll get this through hands at once." So a knife boy is the boy who cleaned the table knives. And then he begged Mr. Utterson to follow him, and led the way to the back garden. "Now, sir," said he, You come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go. So Poole gives instructions to Utterson, but he still doesn't explain what kind of change he has found in his master. He leads Utterson and builds his suspense, just like we are being led blindly through the story. Stevenson often uses his characters in this way to guide the revelation of truth for their fellow characters. And this is one reason why this particular chapter is so important. Throughout it, there's the building of tension and suspense, which could potentially come up in an exam. So, there's often questions relating to suspense and tension in relation to Jekyll and Hyde, so it is quite likely that a scene from this chapter could come up. Mr. Utterson's nerves at this unlooked for termination gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance, but he recollected his courage and followed the butler into the laboratory building and through the surgical theatre with its lumber of crates and bottles to the foot of the stair. So though the activities of Hyde have been unnaturally grotesque, and sort of this, we get later on, there's the revelation that both of them think it's Hyde that's in the room, but this is why it's unnerving. They're not really speaking about it, but there's something on both of their minds. But the presence of medicines, instruments of science and chemicals around the story has given a background of reason and legitimacy, so it kind of makes it seem like there's a reason behind it. They'll get to the bottom of it. The use of science gives it reason and legitimacy. Here Poole motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call on his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door. "Mr. Utterson, sir, asking to see you," he called, and even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to give ear. A voice answered from within. "Tell him I cannot see anyone," it said complainingly. "Thank you, sir," said Poole, with a note of something like triumph in his voice, and taking up his candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen, where the fire was out and the beetles were leaping on the floor. "Sir," he said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eyes, "was that my master's voice?" "It seems much changed," replied the lawyer, very pale, but giving look for look. "Changed? Well, yes, I think so," said the butler. "Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived about his voice? No, sir. Master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago, when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there, is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson." So we see the use of metaphorical language and colloquial language and sort of everyday speech here. And euphemistic language as well, used by Poole to determine his social class. But he's basically saying that he thinks that his master's been murdered. "This is a very strange tale, Poole. This is rather a wild tale, my man," said Mr. Utterson, biting his finger. "Suppose it were as you suppose. Supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, murdered, what could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason." So Utterson's looking for a reason, looking for an explanation, looking for some legitimacy. He's always thinking very, very rationally, and he's saying, well, why would the murderer hang about if he's murdered him? That doesn't make any sense at all. "Well, Mr. Utterson, you are a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet," said Poole. "All this last week, you must know him or it, or whatever it is that lives in that cabinet, has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine and cannot get it to his mind." And so Poole's description of the broken voice of the presence within the cabinet, whose demands for the drug grow even more desperate, almost makes us feel a sense of pity. It's almost as if the person in there is a drug addict, desperate for relief, and he's clearly in unending pain, so it makes us feel quite empathetic and sorry for this character. It was sometimes his way, the master's that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stair. "We've had nothing else this week back, nothing but papers and a closed door, and the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody was looking. Well, sir, every day, aye, and twice and thrice in the same day, there have been orders and complaints, and I have been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it, because it was not pure, and another order to a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir, whatever for. So the medicines that Poole brings back for Jekyll is described as not pure. So now that the chemicals are being found impure, the supernatural side begins to reign. So we get this idea of the supernatural taking over. Have you any of these papers? Asked Mr. Utterson. Poole felt in his pocket and handed out a crumpled note, which the lawyer, bending nearer to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus: Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to Messrs. Moore. He assures them that their last sample is impure and quite useless for his present purpose. In the year 18, Dr. J purchased a somewhat large quantity from Messrs. M. He now begs them to search with the most sedulous care, and should any of the same quality be left, to forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration. The importance of this is to Dr. J, and hardly to be exaggerated. So far the letter had run composedly enough, but here, with a sudden splutter of the pen, the writer's emotions had broken loose. For God's sake, he added, find me some of the old. So we see the emergence of the theme of the duality of man here. So there are two sides to this personality who has written this letter. This is a strange note, said Mr. Utterson, and then sharply, how do you come to have it open? The man at Moore's was main angry, sir, and he threw it back to me like so much dirt, returned Poole. This is unquestionably the doctor's hand, do you know? Resumed the lawyer. I thought it looked like it, so Utterson is saying this is unquestionably Jekyll's handwriting. I thought it looked like it, said the servant rather sulkily, and then with another voice, but what matters hand of right, he said. I've seen him. Seen him? Repeated Mr. Utterson. Well, that's it, said Poole. It was this way. I came suddenly into the theatre from the garden. It seems he had slipped out to look for this drug, or whatever it is, for the cabinet door was open, and there he was at the far end of the room, digging among the crates. So this is a really key quotation. You might want to make note of it on your notepad if you have got a notepad next to you. We've got the use of animalistic imagery here, so identifying it as animalistic imagery will award you for assessment objective 2. Used to describe the action of the man. The person is being dehumanized here, this person who's inside this room. It could also link to Darwin's theory of evolution, which we'll look into later on in a bit more detail, but if you just make note of it on your notes, then when we make a link to it, it will become a bit clearer. He looked up when I came in, gave a kind of cry, and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. So again, further animalistic imagery used here. So Stevenson uses an effective cluster of animal images to emphasize the bestial nature of Hyde. So, I mean, I am spoiling it for you guys, and I apologize, but it's Hyde that's in there. So he's emphasizing the bestial nature of Hyde. These are thematic images because they are used to underpin the themes of the double and the beast in man. It was but for 1 minute that I saw him, but the hair stood upon my head like quills. Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? So the mask motif, or the image of the mask, recurs several times throughout the novel, emphasizing the theme of the dual personality. And we'll revisit this motif of the mask later as well. If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? So again, we've got further emphasis on the use of animalistic imagery. So like a rat, the simile of like a rat makes it seem like this person is inhuman, so dehumanizing him, making him seem like an animal, emotionless, savage. This helps us to share Poole's terror as well, and strengthens the secretive and furtive nature of whoever or whatever this creature is, as it desperately attempts to evade detection. I have served him long enough. And then the man paused and passed his hand over his face. These are all very strange circumstances, said Mr. Utterson, but I think I begin to see daylight. Your master, Poole, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice. Hence the mask and the avoidance of his friends. Hence his eagerness to find this drug, by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grant that to be not deceived. There is my explanation. It is sad enough, Poole, aye, and appalling to consider, but it is plain and natural, hangs well together, and delivers us from the exorbitant alarms. Now, Poole's explanation leads only to murder, and Utterson's leads to madness. So he's saying that Jekyll's lost his mind, he's gone mad. Poole's explanation, however, at least touches on the anguish that Jekyll has gone through. So Poole seems to empathise with his master. He's very devoted to Jekyll as a servant. He's very, very loyal to him, and he understands and empathises that he's clearly in a lot of pain. Whereas Utterson seems to be avoiding this idea fearfully, as if he's not going to get into the emotional side of it. He's not going to humanise Jekyll in the way he deserves to be humanized. I mean, he respects him as a professional and as a friend, but for some reason he's very much removed from the human side and human connection. I've already spoken about how these men are all bachelors and what that suggests, and why they're so removed from one another, and why they don't really discuss personal matters with one another, despite having a close relationship. So you might want to, if you've not watched the previous videos, you might want to watch that. Sir, said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor, that thing was not my master, and there's the truth. My master, here he looked round him and began to whisper, is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf. So we see the occurrence of the duality of man here, or the beast in man. We've got contrasting images of Jekyll and Hyde. So the contrasting images build Jekyll as honourable and respectable, so somebody who's beautiful and who's good to look at, and pleasant to look at, but Hyde as detestable again, so he's dwarfish, he's strange, he's peculiar, he's savage. Utterson attempted to protest. "Oh, sir," cried Poole, "do you think I do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes to in the cabinet door, where I saw him every morning of my life? No, sir, that thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. God knows what it was, but it was never Dr. Jekyll, and it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done." "Poole," replied the lawyer, "if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feelings, much as I am puzzled by this note which seems to prove him to be still alive, I shall consider it my duty to break in that door." "Ah, Mr. Utterson, that's talking," cried the butler. "And now comes the second question," resumed Utterson. Who is going to do it?" "Why, you and me," was the undaunted reply. "That's very well said," returned the lawyer, "and whatever comes of it, I shall make it my business to see you are no loser. There is an axe in the theatre," continued Poole, "and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself." The lawyer took that rude but weighty instrument into his hand, and balanced it. "Do you know, Poole," he said, looking up, "that you and I are about to place ourselves in a position of some peril?" "You may say so, sir, indeed," returned the butler. "It is well, then, that we should be frank," said the other. "We both think more than we have said. Let us make a clean breast. This masked figure that you saw, did you recognize it? So you might want to make note of this quotation here as well. We both think more than we have said. Let us make clean breast, because it links to quite a few different themes. So here Utterson breaks the silence and admits the condition that has been affecting his society. So the condition of denial. He asks Poole to be honest with him, and the pair expose their suspicions to each other. "Well, sir, it went so quick, and the creature was so doubled up, that I could hardly swear to that," was the answer. "But if you mean, was it Mr. Hyde, why, yes, I think it was. You see, it was much of the same bigness, and it had the same quick, light way with it. And then, who else could have got in by the laboratory door? You have not forgot, sir, that at the time of the murder he had still the key with him. But that's not all. I don't know, Mr. Utterson, if ever you met this Mr. Hyde." "Yes," said the lawyer, "I once spoke with him." "Then you must know, as well as the rest of us, that there was something queer about the gentleman. So you might want to make note of this quotation as well, something queer. something that gave a man a turn. I don't know rightly how to say it, sir, beyond this, that you felt it in your marrow, kind of cold and thin. So we've got the recurring theme of hypocrisy, which is prevalent throughout the novel, and I've discussed it in great length. And this is sort of repeating what I've already sort of said, so I'm not going to go into detail about it. But no one can quite explain why they feel so repulsed by Hyde, not even the lower class Poole here. I own I felt something of that, of what you describe, said Mr. Utterson. Quite so, sir, returned Poole. Well, when that masked thing, like a monkey, jumped from among the chemicals and whipped into the cabinet, it went down my spine like ice. So he describes again Hyde as like a monkey. So that's another key quotation that you might want to make note of. And I'm just going to really quickly link this to AO3 context. So one of the things that a lot of theorists relate to this novel, and rightly so because it was so recurrent throughout the Victorian period, is Darwinism. So when Charles Darwin's On the Origins of Species was published in 1859, many Victorians were thrown into panic and turmoil over what evolution could mean for their religious views and their ways of life. There were many reasons that contributed to this worry, but one of the main culprits was the idea of de-evolution, or more specifically the possibility of the prim and proper Victorian ladies and gentlemen having the potential to revert back to a savage and beast-like state. At the time, Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde explored these fears and laid out the consequences of giving into one's basic animalistic nature. So this is a real clear link to the theme or the theory of evolution here, and Darwinism, and Stevenson's links to Darwinism. Oh, I know it's not evidence, Mr. Utterson. I'm book-learned enough for that. So book-learned here means formally educated. But a man has his feelings, and I give you my Bible word it was Mr. Hyde. Aye, aye, said the lawyer, my fears incline to the same point. Evil, I fear, founded evil was sure to come of that connection. Aye, truly, I believe you. I believe poor Harry is killed, and I believe this murderer, for what purpose God alone can tell, is still lurking in his victim's room. Well, let our name be vengeance. Call Bradshaw. So the relief that they both feel in the common knowledge that Hyde is the mysterious man that they've been referring to is enough to bond them in a common cause here. So I'm going to finish here. Part 2 will be available next week. If you have found this video useful, then please remember to comment in relation to the question I asked earlier, like the video, and please subscribe to the channel so that you can get weekly notifications for whenever we upload videos. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.